The first time she saw that face, time seemed to freeze those eyes. Those eyes held no light, only a deep, unfathomable darkness. Every city has its secrets, but some truths are meant to be buried with the dead. Yet this time, even death refused to stay silent. The fog had not lifted yet. It gripped St. Mary Mead like a cold, unrelenting hand, curling around the narrow lanes, slithering through the hedgerows, and wrapping itself around the village's quiet stone houses like a ghostly embrace. The world felt hushed, as if holding its breath, save for the distant clink of china from Mrs. Gosage's kitchen, and the occasional rustle of unseen movement beyond the mist. The scent of damp earth and morning roses lingered in the thick air, and at the very edge of her garden, Miss Jane Marple stood hunched over a rose bush, her gnarled fingers deftly working the pruning shears with a patience only age could teach. The deep red rose before her glistened with dewdrops, tiny jewels that clung as if whispering secrets only she could hear. She straightened, wincing slightly as her joints protested, though it was not discomfort that made her pause, it was instinct, that peculiar prickle at the nape of her neck, that always came before something unusual. As she turned to head back inside, her sharp eyes caught sight of young Tom Hargraves trudging past with his milk cart. His face, normally full of mischief, was drawn, his gaze flickering toward the hedges as if expecting something or someone to emerge. "Morning, Tom," Miss Marple called, her voice gentle yet probing, a tone that had made many a secret spill forth over the years. Tom hesitated, then forced a grin, though it did little to mask the shadow in his eyes. "Mornin', Miss Marple. Heavy air today, ain't it?" "Indeed," she replied, narrowing her gaze ever so slightly. "You're up rather early for someone who barely made it home from the inn last night." His grin faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he tipped his hat, and urged his horse forward. Yet before he disappeared into the mist, his eyes darted once more to the shadows, and Miss Marple did not miss the way his hand twitched at his side, as if itching to wipe away something unseen. She exhaled softly, turning toward her cottage, but her mind was already at work, weaving together stray threads of suspicion into something far more tangible. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to dissipate, but an odd tension still clung to the air. The village square bustled with its usual rhythm, women haggling over cuts of meat at the butcher's stall, the shopkeeper rearranging his flower baskets, the scent of fresh bread drifting through the lanes. But there was a ripple beneath it all, a tremor in the way voices dropped to hushed murmurs. "Have you heard?" Mrs. Gosage's whisper, carried just far enough for Miss Marple's sharp ears to catch. "Reginald Ashford's gone missing, vanished carriage and all into the night." Standing by the village pump, Miss Marple arched a single brow. Ashford had always been an unsettling presence in St. Mary Mead, a man whose wealth dripped from his tailored coats yet never quite masked the predatory gleam in his eyes. "I heard his carriage was seen at the station," Mrs. Gosage continued, voice dropping further, "but not a soul saw him board the train. And the station master, well, he's clammed up tight as a mussel." Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly around her shawl. Murder was an awfully strong word to be throwing about, but there was something in the way the villagers spoke that suggested more than mere speculation. A few paces away, young Tom leaned against a stone wall, his posture deliberately casual, yet his gaze restless, scanning the village as though expecting something, or dreading it. Miss Marple met his eyes for a fleeting moment, before he quickly looked away, rubbing his nose in a nervous tic she had seen far too often in guilty men. "Not much of a loss, is it?" Mrs. Gosage muttered, her tone shifting from fear to disdain. "That man was nothing but trouble, always chasing after money like a dog after a bone." "That's usually how it goes," Miss Marple mused, her voice mild, yet her gaze sharp. "Especially when a man gets a little too comfortable with things he shouldn't." She adjusted her shawl, and took a seat on the bench, but her mind was already threading through the puzzle, pulling at the loose ends. A missing man, an unspoken silence from the station master, the nervous energy of a boy who had surely seen more than he should have. Yes, there was something here, something that lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. As the village carried on in its quiet morning routine, Miss Marple felt the first unmistakable whisper of danger. Trouble was coming to St. Mary Mead, rolling in as quietly as the fog, and she had the distinct feeling that this time, the village's secrets would not stay buried for long. A cursed evening had settled over St. Mary Mead, as if an old tale had risen from its grave. The small village station stood eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of rotting wooden benches and the whispering wind that carried the scent of damp earth. The platform was nearly empty, except for one lone figure, Station Master Albert Finch, a wiry man with restless hands and haunted eyes. Something in his stance suggested he was holding back a truth too heavy to bear. The dim light from an old gas lamp flickered uncertainly, casting elongated shadows over the crumpled body at the far end of the platform. Gregory Wilton, a city man who never quite belonged here. His face was frozen in an expression of unease, his hand raised slightly, reaching, not in pain, but in desperate longing, as if something vital had been snatched away from him at the final moment. Constable Raymond Grahams and his partner, Jack Pierce, arrived with an air of forced confidence, their inexperience showing in their uncertain movements. "Did anyone see what happened?" Pierce asked, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. Finch inhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No, just the sound of the train's whistle, and when I looked, he was already here." There was something off about his tone, like a man wrestling with his own conscience. Grahams knelt beside Wilton's lifeless body, eyes scanning the peculiar way the limbs had fallen. "This wasn't a simple fall," he murmured. "The angle, the stiffened fingers, the slightly raised arm, it told a different story, one far more deliberate." A few feet away, seated on a bench, was a figure most had overlooked, Miss Evelyn Harcourt. The elderly woman sat knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically as she watched with sharp, knowing eyes. "You're both looking, but you're not seeing," she murmured with a faint smile. Grahams hesitated before turning to her, skeptical but intrigued. "Look at his hand," she continued, pointing her knitting needle toward Wilton's raised fingers. "He wasn't shielding himself, he was reaching for something small, something that isn't there anymore." Finch shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward an old notice board near the station's entrance. A tattered yellowed poster hung there, barely clinging to the wood, but something was missing. The torn edge suggested that a piece had been ripped away recently. Pierce stepped closer, running his fingers along the frayed paper. "Someone took something from here," he murmured. "But what?" "A small, crucial object that had to be hidden before Wilton died, or a secret so damning that someone had killed to keep it buried." Miss Harcourt resumed her knitting, the corners of her lips curling into a knowing smile. "This isn't a simple murder," she said quietly. "It's something older, something deeper." And just then a gust of cold wind swept through the station, as if some long-forgotten secret was stirring awake. The rain had come down in heavy sheets that evening, swallowing up the quiet village of Blackwood Hollow, and leaving only the mournful whistle of the approaching midnight train to mark the passage of time. The station, a crumbling relic of another era, stood in eerie silence, its benches damp with neglect, the wooden planks beneath them groaning under the weight of unseen memories. A single flickering gaslight did little to chase away the deep shadows that clung to the edges of the platform, making the lone figure of Station Master Rupert Hawthorne seem almost ghostly as he stood near the entrance, wringing his hands. His uniform, though neatly pressed, bore the stains of age, his brass buttons catching the dim light like tiny reluctant stars. But his usual air of calm was absent tonight. His face was pale, his movements jittery, as though something had rattled him to his very core. Detective Inspector Hugh Carter and Constable Felix Graves had arrived with an air of forced authority, their boots clicking against the damp wood as they approached the station master. They were both new to Blackwood Hollow, men of rigid methods, unaccustomed to the way things worked in a place where secrets buried themselves deep. "Tell us exactly what you saw," Carter said, his voice cutting through the heavy quiet like a knife. Hawthorne hesitated before lifting a trembling hand and pointing toward the waiting room, a small dimly lit chamber filled with the stale scent of old newspapers, damp wood, and the ghost of a cigar recently smoked. "He was there," he whispered, "just sitting there, but he wasn't breathing, and his eyes—" Hawthorne stopped himself, swallowed, and looked away. Graves stepped inside first, his posture stiff with unease, his gaze falling immediately on the figure slumped in the farthest corner of the room. Edward Lansing, a well-dressed man known for his wealth and arrogance, sat frozen in death, his lifeless eyes staring at something unseen above him. His mouth was slightly open, as though mid-sentence, one hand still loosely gripping the pocket watch he had been known to obsessively check. His coat, usually pristine, was draped neatly beside him, but his posture, his twisted unnatural slouch, suggested he had not gone gently. A slow death, a deliberate one. Carter crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. "This isn't natural," he murmured. Graves nodded, his throat dry. "It looks like he just stopped, but there was something else. Something subtle, yet telling." The train schedule, pinned to the wall beside the entrance, had been altered. A tear ran along its bottom edge, small but deliberate. Miss Eleanor Finch, seated quietly on the farthest bench, her knitting needles clicking softly, raised an eyebrow. She had been watching them, unseen until now, a small smirk playing on her lips. "You're missing something," she murmured. Carter turned, brow furrowed. "And what's that?" She motioned lazily toward the schedule with her needle. "That wasn't torn yesterday." The room fell into silence. Hawthorne shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the timetable before quickly looking away. "It's just old," he muttered. But Finch chuckled softly. "Old things don't tear themselves at the perfect moment, dear." Carter stood, his gaze narrowing as he examined the tear. "Someone wanted us to believe something that isn't true," he said. "The question is, what exactly were they trying to change?" He turned back to Lansing's frozen figure, his fingers twitching. The air felt thick with something unseen, something lingering just beyond reach. And for the first time in years, the old station felt truly haunted, not by ghosts, but by a crime more sinister than anyone had yet realized. The heavy mist curled through the streets of Ashford-on-Lee, swallowing the gaslights and turning every figure into a wraith of shifting shadows. The village, usually serene in its nightly slumber, seemed to hold its breath as if it, too, sensed the undercurrent of unease that had settled over the constabulary. Inside the dimly lit office, the air was thick with tension, the only sound the rhythmic tapping of Inspector Caldwell's fingers against the battered wooden desk. His sharp eyes bore into the man seated across from him, a man who by all outward appearances should have been untouchable. Lawrence Henshaw, a figure of wealth and influence, sat with an almost studied nonchalance, his hands folded neatly before him, his suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour. But beneath that polished exterior, there was something else. Something restless. A flicker of calculation in his otherwise unreadable gaze. "You're certain about this, Mr. Henshaw?" Caldwell's voice was calm, but there was a blade's edge beneath it, sharp enough to cut through any pretense. He leaned forward slightly, his presence looming, waiting for the man to crack, even if just a little. Henshaw exhaled, slow and deliberate, his fingers adjusting the cufflinks of his dark wool suit, as if the entire affair was nothing more than a tedious inconvenience. "I was on the train, Inspector," he said, his voice clipped, measured, "the midnight express. I boarded alone, I remained alone, and I arrived alone. There is nothing more to say." From the shadowed corner of the room, Eleanor Whitmore watched in silence, her sharp gaze taking in every minute detail. Unlike Caldwell, she didn't apply pressure with words. She observed, let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, let people fill the void with their own unraveling. When she finally stepped forward, it was with the kind of grace that came from years of moving unnoticed, her hands resting lightly on the back of the constable's chair. "You don't believe him," she murmured. "It wasn't a question," Caldwell exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not about belief," he muttered. "It's about fact, and the facts don't fit." Henshaw's lips curled into something that might have been amusement, but the smile never quite reached his eyes. "And what exactly doesn't fit, Inspector?" His voice was smooth, almost lazy, but there was an undeniable weight behind his words. A challenge. Caldwell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the timetable pinned to the notice board behind him, its edges worn from years of handling. His fingers traced the printed columns of train schedules, then stopped. The midnight train. It had been delayed. Only by 8 minutes, insignificant to the average traveler, but damning under scrutiny. Henshaw would have known that if he'd really been on it. Caldwell set the paper down and turned back to his suspect. "It's odd, don't you think?" he mused. "You were so precise about the time, so confident. But you never mentioned the delay." The words hung between them like a noose tightening inch by inch. Henshaw's expression didn't shift, but the pause before he spoke was just a fraction too long. "I must not have noticed," he said finally, his voice even. Eleanor tilted her head, watching him with quiet intensity. "A man like you notices everything," she murmured. The silence that followed was thick, stretching between them like a drawn wire. Outside, the church bell rang, its chime muffled by the fog. The village was waking, but here, in this room, time felt suspended, each second dragging, each breath measured. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You lied." Henshaw's fingers curled into his palms, the first betrayal of tension. "If I did," he said slowly, "then you'll have to prove it." Eleanor's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile but something close. "Oh," she said softly, "we will." And as the fog thickened outside, swallowing the gaslight glow and turning the world into a shifting, uncertain landscape, Caldwell knew with bone-deep certainty that the game had only just begun. The morning mist clung to the narrow streets of Blackwood Hollow, thick and unyielding, swallowing sound and turning every figure into a ghostly silhouette. Eliza Harcourt moved through it with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime listening rather than speaking, her woolen shawl drawn tight around her narrow shoulders. She knew the rhythm of the village well, each footstep, each shifting shadow, each hushed murmur behind lace-curtained windows. But today, something was wrong. The village wasn't just waking, it was watching, waiting, holding its breath. She could feel it in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken words. The train station emerged from the fog ahead of her, a squat, unremarkable building whose peeling paint and soot-streaked windows told stories of arrivals and departures no one ever thought to question. But Eliza questioned everything. She stepped onto the platform, her gaze sweeping over the space with practiced ease. At first glance there was nothing unusual, just a few weary travelers clutching their coats against the morning chill, a station master adjusting his pocket watch. But then her eyes landed on the timetable. Something was off. The board was old, its corners curling from years of neglect, but someone had tampered with it. The ink was faint in places, smudged as if deliberately altered, and in the top right corner, a subtle tear marred the paper. It was small, small enough that most wouldn't have noticed, but small things had a way of adding up. She stepped closer, fingers grazing the paper lightly. The midnight train, the train that should have left at 11:45 p.m. was now listed at 11:50 p.m., a mere 5-minute discrepancy. But time, in an alibi, was everything. The change was meant to be unnoticed, but to Eliza, it screamed deception. Someone had altered the schedule, and whoever had done it wasn't just covering tracks, they were creating them. A gust of wind rustled the station doors, and a figure passed by behind her, their presence lingering just long enough to make her spine stiffen. When she turned, they were already gone, swallowed by the mist, but the scent of stale tobacco lingered in the air, a habit, a signature. Eliza's lips pressed together as she let her fingers slip from the paper. The answers weren't here, not yet. But the village was full of cracks, and in the right light, secrets had a way of seeping through. She moved toward the Fox and Finch, the only tea room in Blackwood Hollow worth visiting, its windows already fogged with the warmth of fresh brewed tea and whispered conversations. The moment she stepped inside, the hum of voices faltered, if only for a second. She wasn't unexpected. Eliza Harcourt was never unexpected, but her presence carried weight. She settled into her usual corner by the window, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as the conversation slowly resumed, though now tinged with a nervous edge. A teapot landed on her table with a soft clink, and Agnes Bellamy, the tea-room's owner, folded her arms, one brow arched in quiet amusement. "Lovely day for a mystery, Miss Harcourt," she mused, her voice low enough that only Eliza could hear. "You're not here for the tea, are you?" Eliza wrapped her hands around the warm porcelain, tilting her head slightly. "Would you believe me if I said I was?" Agnes huffed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not for a second." Eliza's lips curved slightly as she lifted her cup, her gaze never leaving the room. "Then tell me, Agnes, what's the whisper in the wind today?" Agnes hesitated, glancing toward the counter where a young porter sat nursing a coffee, his hands a fraction too still, his posture just a bit too rigid. "Henry Cobb," she murmured, "railway worker. Been off since yesterday morning, claims he's under the weather, but I've seen him checking the station clock more times than he's checked his tea. He's got the look of someone who's seen something he wasn't meant to." Eliza took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through her as her mind clicked through the possibilities. If Cobb had seen something, he wouldn't speak freely, not yet. But fear made men careless. "Leave him to me," she murmured, setting down her cup with deliberate ease. "The truth has a way of slipping through the cracks." Outside, the mist curled through the streets like fingers pressing against glass, blurring the edges of reality. And somewhere in that shifting grey, Eliza knew someone was watching. The question was, how long before they made their next move? A rainy evening had settled over the quiet town as Eliza Harcourt stepped onto its deserted streets. Every corner, every alley was familiar to her, yet tonight something felt different. The air carried a strange weight, an unshakable presence that made her footsteps sound louder against the damp cobblestones. The town looked just as pristine as always, yet the silence felt unnatural, as if the place itself was holding its breath, waiting. As she neared the train station, it appeared the same as ever, small, unassuming, and lifeless. But tonight, there was something off, something lurking beneath the surface. The platform was empty, save for a single dimly flickering brass lamp that barely cut through the mist. The station master was nowhere in sight, only the old signal bell swayed slightly in the wind, a ghostly echo of the last chime it had rung hours ago. She stepped inside cautiously, inhaling the stale scent of old bread and tobacco, remnants of a night long past. Her gaze landed on the notice board where train schedules were always posted, and that's when she saw it, something minuscule yet glaringly out of place. The Midnight Express, which was supposed to leave at 11:50 p.m., had been changed to 11:55. A mere 5-minute difference, but for someone like Eliza, such tiny inconsistencies were often the key to unraveling something far bigger. A simple clerical error, or a deliberate alteration. To Eliza, this was no accident. This was a thread, a loose stitch in the fabric of a larger mystery. She reached out and ran her fingers over the worn paper, feeling a slight dampness at its torn edges, as if someone had tried to rip it away in haste, but stopped midway. Whatever had happened, it had happened before dawn, and whoever had changed the schedule had done it with a purpose. The question was, what was the motive, and had anyone else noticed? There was only one place to find out, the town's tea room, the heart of all whispers and hidden truths. When she arrived, the atmosphere was as warm and inviting as always, yet tonight, there was a subtle shift in the air. Conversations were hushed, glances were exchanged with careful deliberation, and the usual air of mundane gossip had taken on a sharper, more secretive edge. Eliza took her usual seat, and within moments the waitress approached, offering a polite but knowing smile. "Strange night, Miss Harcourt," the waitress said as she set down a steaming cup of tea. "I don't know if you've heard, but there's been talk about last night's train. Something's not quite right." Eliza lifted the cup but did not drink, instead allowing the words to settle. "What kind of talk?" The waitress glanced around as if ensuring no one was listening, then leaned in slightly. "The conductor, Mr. Caldwell, he's been acting strangely. I saw him this morning, pacing near the station, looking shaken. He kept saying something wasn't right, but when I pressed him, he just clammed up." Eliza's mind was a nervous conductor, a changed train schedule. Was this all just a coincidence, or was someone deliberately trying to hide something? There was only one way to find out. She needed to speak to Caldwell himself. Back at the station, she found him in the shadowy recess of an old brick alcove. He stood against the wall, hands clasped tightly in front of him, shoulders tense. Every few seconds he shifted, casting wary glances as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," Eliza greeted him with a polite smile. The conductor stiffened, clearly startled. "Ah, Miss Harcourt, what brings you here?" "Just a bit of conversation," she replied smoothly, stepping closer. "I hear last night's journey was unusual." He hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "I can't say much, Miss Harcourt. Only that, the train left at its usual time, but something happened that shouldn't have." Eliza's voice dropped to a softer, more coaxing tone. "And what was that?" A heavy silence stretched between them. Then in barely a whisper, Caldwell admitted, "There was a man, he boarded the train last night. His name wasn't on the passenger list, and when the train arrived this morning, he was gone." A chill ran down Eliza's spine. A man who got on the train but never got off. This wasn't just an irregularity in the schedule, this was the start of something much bigger. The storm had not yet arrived, but the air was thick with its warning, a suffocating tension that made the streets of Blackwood Hollow feel even more desolate. The mist slithered through the alleyways, curling around the dimly lit gas lamps, and muffling the sound of Amelia Vance's footsteps as she stepped onto the train platform. The station was eerily empty, the kind of quiet that didn't come naturally, but was imposed by something unseen. A single attendant stood by the ticket booth, his shoulders hunched, fingers drumming against the wooden counter in a rhythmic, nervous pattern. Amelia wasn't here for a train, she was here for answers. It had started with a name, a whispered warning passed between hushed voices at the town's only tea shop. Daniel Graves, a man who had boarded the 11:45 train 2 nights ago and never arrived at his destination. No record of him stepping off, no reports of foul play, just a man swallowed by the very thing meant to take him somewhere. But what had truly unsettled Amelia was not just his disappearance, it was a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that most would have missed it. The train's schedule had been altered that night, a shift of exactly 6 minutes. Most people wouldn't notice 6 minutes. Most people wouldn't care. Amelia did. She stepped closer to the ticket counter, her movements deliberate, her eyes sharp as they studied the man before her. "Busy night?" she asked smoothly, her voice carrying the easy warmth of someone making casual conversation. The attendant flinched, as if pulled from a deep, uneasy thought. His eyes darted toward the empty platform before returning to her. "No, miss," he muttered, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like guilt. "Last train passed through hours ago." Amelia leaned slightly against the counter, her gloved fingers tracing an absent pattern along its surface. "Strange thing though," she murmured, tilting her head. "The midnight train's schedule was changed a few nights ago, wasn't it?" The drumming of his fingers stopped. His jaw tightened. "I wouldn't know about that," he said quickly. Too quickly. "A lie. A poor one." Amelia arched an eyebrow, letting the silence stretch. People always underestimated silence. It was more powerful than any direct question, more unsettling than any accusation. The man cracked under its weight. "He told me to change it," the attendant whispered finally, his voice barely audible over the distant howl of the wind. His hands clenched into fists, as if gripping something unseen. "Said it had to be done, and that I should ask no questions." Amelia's pulse quickened, though her expression remained calm. "Who?" she asked softly. The man hesitated, the hesitation of a man who knew that speaking the truth might cost him something, perhaps more than he could afford to lose. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his gaze flickering once more toward the empty platform, as if expecting something to emerge from the mist. "A man in a dark coat," he admitted, voice barely above a breath. "I never saw his face, he just appeared. Spoke to me like he knew me, like he'd been watching. He didn't threaten me, not exactly, but the way he said it, it was enough. Enough for you to do what?" His hands trembled slightly. "Enough for me to change the schedule. Just 6 minutes. He said it had to be done, that it was important, that I shouldn't think about it." 6 minutes. A minor change to a train schedule, but Amelia knew better than to ignore the small things, because small things were the cracks in a facade, and cracks had a habit of deepening until the whole thing came crashing down. She studied the man for a moment longer before offering a slight nod. As she stepped away from the counter, the mist seemed thicker, the quiet even more unnatural. The pieces of this mystery were beginning to align, but the picture they formed was still unclear. A name, a vanished man, a stranger pulling strings in the darkness. Blackwood Hollow had always been a place where secrets festered beneath polite smiles and warm cups of tea. But now Amelia knew, this was no ordinary mystery. This was a warning. The evening mist clung to the cobblestone streets like a restless spectre, curling around the towering iron gates of the Ravenshade estate. Eloise Hawthorne stood just beyond them, her sharp eyes fixed on the looming mansion ahead, a structure drenched in wealth and secrecy. The stained glass windows flickered with the warm glow of candlelight, casting eerie patterns against the ivy-clad walls, but even the beauty of its architecture couldn't mask the unease that hung in the air like an unspoken warning. She had been summoned, though the note had come unsigned. That alone told her everything. No one invited Eloise Hawthorne, unless they were either desperate or deeply entangled in something they couldn't escape. She stepped forward, the heavy gates groaning as they parted, and was immediately greeted by a butler with hollowed eyes and an expression that betrayed nothing. "Miss Hawthorne, you are expected," he murmured, his voice carefully void of emotion. She followed him inside, the click of her heels swallowed by the thick Persian rugs lining the grand hall. The scent of aged parchment, polished mahogany, and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. The manor was a fortress, a place designed to impress and intimidate, but beneath the veneer of opulence something was amiss. The corridors were too silent, the candle flames barely flickered, as if the air itself held its breath. As she was led into the drawing room, her gaze fell upon the man she had anticipated seeing. Victor Renlow, the enigmatic financier, whose reputation was as untarnished as his perfectly pressed suit. He sat by the fireplace, his fingers wrapped around a crystal tumbler of brandy, his expression one of carefully measured control. But Eloise saw the truth in the way his shoulders were held too rigidly, the way his gaze flickered to the shadows of the room before settling on her. "Miss Hawthorne," he greeted, offering a ghost of a smile, "I appreciate you coming on such short notice." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You made it sound urgent," she said, glancing at the untouched second glass of brandy on the table beside her. "It usually is with men like you." Renlow exhaled sharply through his nose, amused despite himself. "There's been a complication," he admitted, his fingers tightening around his drink. A business partner of mine, Raymond Ashcombe, was found dead in his study 3 nights ago. An unfortunate accident, the authorities believe. Eloise lifted an eyebrow. And you don't? Renlo took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence settle between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, darker. Raymond was no fool, and he was no victim of chance. The night before his death, he came to me, speaking of numbers that didn't add up, of funds shifting where they shouldn't. He said he had proof that someone was manipulating the firm from within. Eloise leaned forward slightly, her keen mind already threading the pieces together. And you think that proof is still out there? Renlo's jaw tensed. I know it is, but I also know that whoever silenced Raymond won't hesitate to do it again. The fire crackled between them, sending flickering shadows dancing across the walls. Eloise tapped a gloved finger against her knee, thinking, someone within the company, someone close enough to have access to Ashcombe's findings, had made sure the truth never saw the light of day. And if that person believed the danger had passed, they were mistaken. Where do I start? She asked at last. Renlo set his drink down, his eyes gleaming with something that might have been relief or fear. Ashcombe's office, everything was cleared out after his death, but I have a feeling they weren't as thorough as they should have been. Eloise nodded, her pulse steady despite the storm brewing beneath the surface. Someone had buried the truth, but the thing about buried secrets, they never stayed hidden for long. The heavy scent of aged mahogany and flickering candlelight set an oppressive air in the dimly lit drawing room of Renford Manor. The storm outside rattled the window panes, casting long wavering shadows across the polished floor. Eloise Hawthorne's sharp gaze drifted to the woman standing by the grand fireplace, her silhouette poised yet unreadable. Clara Whitmore, always elegant, always enigmatic, was watching her with that same knowing smile, a smile that never quite reached her piercing emerald eyes. I didn't expect to see you here, Eloise remarked, her tone laced with quiet suspicion. Clara stepped forward, the sharp click of her heels on the marble floor slicing through the tension. I wasn't aware I needed an invitation, she countered smoothly, her voice a careful balance of charm and steel. Eloise let the words settle, studying the subtle tension in Clara's jaw, the controlled rise and fall of her breath. No, I suppose you don't, she murmured, her attention flickering briefly to the man seated across from her, Julian Renford. The powerful financier had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, yet tonight, he looked anything but in control. His fingers curled too tightly around his glass of whiskey, his eyes darting to Clara with something dangerously close to apprehension. I was just telling Miss Hawthorne about our dear departed friend, Mr. Ashcombe, Renford said, his voice smooth, but there was an unshakable edge of tension beneath it. Such an unfortunate accident. Clara's lips curled in something that almost resembled amusement. Yes, unfortunate. Eloise didn't miss the flicker of unease that passed between them. A silent conversation neither of them intended for her to witness, but she had spent too many years unearthing the secrets of men who thought themselves untouchable to ignore the weight of what was left unsaid. I imagine you both must have been quite close to him, Eloise mused, swirling the amber liquid in her own untouched glass. Business partners, after all, share so much more than just financial interests. Renford exhaled, measured but wary. Raymond was a complicated man. His mind was brilliant, but his trust in the wrong people may have cost him dearly. Trust can be a dangerous thing, Eloise agreed, her gaze drifting back to Clara, watching for the slightest crack in her carefully curated facade. Especially when misplaced. Clara tilted her head, feigning nonchalance. Is that what you think happened? I think, Eloise said slowly, that Raymond was on the verge of discovering something he wasn't meant to, and I think someone ensured he never got the chance to reveal it. A tense silence thickened the air. Outside, the storm raged on, rain hammering against the windows like impatient fingers drumming against glass. Clara's expression remained unreadable, but Renford shifted uncomfortably, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. "A fascinating theory," Clara murmured, her tone almost playful, but the gleam in her eyes was razor-sharp. "But theories require proof, Miss Hawthorne." Eloise smiled, slow and deliberate. "That's the easy part." She reached into her bag, pulling out a folded slip of paper. With a flick of her wrist, she laid it on the polished mahogany table between them. A transaction record, the ink still crisp, dated the night of Ashcombe's death, a significant sum transferred from Renford's account to a name neither of them had expected her to find. Charles Renfield, the same man who had altered Ashcombe's travel itinerary that night. The same man who had been seen near the estate just before Ashcombe took his final breath. Renford paled, his grip tightening on his glass. Clara, for the first time, went utterly still. "Money," Eloise murmured, leaning back in her chair, her voice laced with quiet satisfaction. "It leaves a trail, and this particular trail leads straight back to you." The fire crackled in the hearth, but the room had grown cold. The web of deception, so carefully woven, was beginning to unravel, and Eloise Hawthorne was holding the final thread. The fire burned low, embers pulsing like dying stars in the quiet solitude of Eleanor Graves' study. The room was heavy with the scent of aged paper and ink, the air thick with an unspoken tension. A wall of bookshelves towered over her, their leather-bound spines standing like silent sentinels guarding the secrets buried in their pages. Stacks of documents lay scattered across the grand oak desk, their contents a tangled web of financial transactions, faded receipts and hurriedly scribbled notes, pieces of a puzzle that had been meticulously arranged, yet still lacked the final damning piece. At the center of it all sat a single creased photograph, its edges worn by time and by Eleanor's constant touch. She stared at it, her sharp eyes scanning every detail as if the image itself might whisper a truth she had not yet deciphered. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, a slow metronome counting down the inevitable. Her fingers ghosted over the margins of an old ledger, tracing the careful but damning numbers. Among the routine transactions, buried beneath layers of deception, lay an anomaly, a name that should not have appeared, an amount transferred at an hour that reeked of finality. The date was significant, the very night Harold Benedict had met his untimely end. A man of power, of reputation, reduced to a footnote in the city's grim history. But Eleanor knew that his death had been no accident, no random act of violence. It was calculated, premeditated, a move made to silence a man who had known too much. And now, staring at the ledger's damning proof, she realized that the trail of deception led straight to Donovan Hale. Hale, the man who had stood at Benedict's side for years, trusted and respected, until trust became betrayal, and loyalty became something far more insidious. He was too careful, too precise, never leaving behind a thread loose enough to pull. But tonight, Eleanor had found one. The floorboards groaned under a shifting weight. The study door, left slightly ajar, creaked open further. Eleanor didn't turn. She didn't need to. The air changed, the temperature dropping as the presence behind her made itself known. A voice, smooth as polished steel, broke the silence. "You've been digging." Eleanor allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Numbers don't lie. She lifted the ledger slightly, its weight heavier now with the truth it carried. Neither do ledgers that weren't meant to be found. Donovan Hale stepped into the firelight, his features chiseled by the flickering glow. His expression was unreadable, his movements deliberate, measured, but Eleanor caught the slight tension in his jaw, the subtle twitch in his fingers, a tell he had yet to master. He was uncomfortable, and that was a rarity. "You think you understand," he said, his voice a careful blend of curiosity and warning. "But you don't, not yet." Eleanor finally turned to face him, her gaze sharp, unrelenting. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Hale didn't answer immediately. Instead he stepped closer, his presence looming but not quite threatening. The fire crackled between them, casting shifting shadows on the walls, distorting the edges of truth and lies. "You're looking at the wrong thing," he murmured. Eleanor arched a brow. "Am I? Because I think Harold Benedict knew something, and I think he tried to buy his way out before it was too late." She let the words sink in, watching the flicker of something in Hale's expression, calculation, perhaps even amusement. But beneath that, there was something else, something colder. "He transferred money to a name that doesn't exist," she continued, her voice smooth, steady. "A name buried beneath shell accounts, routed through hands that never leave fingerprints. But I found it." She held his gaze, "and I think I know why he was dead just hours later." Hale exhaled slowly, stepping even closer, closing the distance between them. "Be careful, Eleanor." His voice had changed. Gone was the smooth detachment, replaced by something quieter, more dangerous. "You might not like what you find." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I never do," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the ledger. "But that's never stopped me before." The flames in the hearth snapped, sending a cascade of embers swirling into the air. The walls of the study, lined with books and memories, seemed to lean in, bearing witness to the confrontation. The weight of knowledge hung heavy in the air, thick as the scent of old parchment. Somewhere beyond the walls of her quiet sanctuary, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing in this single dimly lit room. But Eleanor knew, without a shadow of doubt, that the final truth was close enough to taste, and once she uncovered it, there would be no turning back. The courtroom pulsed with an almost suffocating intensity, the air thick with unspoken truths, and the weight of inevitable revelation. Every eye was fixed on Victor Langley, the once untouchable businessman, whose empire had been built on carefully concealed deception. His fingers pressed into the wooden arms of his chair, his knuckles white, as though sheer willpower could keep the walls of his fabricated innocence from crumbling. Across from him the prosecutor's voice rang sharp as a blade, slicing through the tension with a single damning question. "Mr. Langley, on the night of Mr. Alden Whittaker's death, were you or were you not responsible for altering the security logs at Grand Terrace Station?" The question hung in the charged silence, and Langley, usually composed, a master of misdirection, hesitated. A flicker of something crossed his face, vanishing as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough. The room, packed with spectators, seemed to contract as anticipation gripped the crowd. In the jury box, 12 sets of eyes bore into him, weighing his every breath. Seated among them, Detective Evelyn Carter remained motionless, her fingers resting lightly on the rim of her notebook, though she hadn't written a word in minutes. She didn't need to. The game was shifting, aligning into the conclusion she had predicted from the very beginning. A witness was called, Arthur Wendell, the station's lead security officer, a man who had spent decades guarding the schedules and integrity of the railway. He stepped forward with the weight of a man carrying an unbearable truth. His voice, though steady, betrayed the deep exhaustion of sleepless nights. "I was given an order," Wendell admitted, his gaze dropping momentarily before meeting the prosecutor's. "Again. An order I was expected to follow without question, but I knew something was wrong. The logs were changed, the timestamps manipulated, the train that should have arrived at 11:45 was rerouted, delayed intentionally." A ripple of whispers coursed through the gallery, and Langley stiffened. Evelyn didn't need to see his face to know he was calculating his next move, grasping for an escape, but there was none. The puzzle was fitting together too perfectly. "Who gave you this order, Mr. Wendell?" The prosecutor's voice pressed forward unwavering. The answer came, slow but steady, "Victor Langley." A collective exhale swept the courtroom. A sound of revelation, of expectation finally met. Langley's grip on his chair tightened, but it was his silence that spoke louder than anything else. He was cornered. But Evelyn knew there was still more than just a fraudulent log, more than a mere delay in a train's arrival. It was about the minutes stolen, the precious seconds manipulated to erase something far more damning. Mr. Langley, the prosecutor continued, voice lethal in its precision, Alden Whittaker died that night, and every single action you took was designed not just to disrupt a timetable, but to erase the one piece of evidence that could have proven the truth. You didn't just delay a train, you delayed justice. The silence that followed was absolute. The weight of it pressed against the walls, filling the room with something almost tangible. Evelyn's breath was slow, measured, her heartbeat steady. The endgame was here. And Victor Langley, a man who had built his fortune on deception, was now trapped in the very web he had so carefully spun. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the tension simmering just beneath the surface, ready to explode at the slightest spark. The polished mahogany walls bore witness to countless trials, but today they would remember one in particular, the day Lionel Eastwood's carefully constructed web of deception began to unravel. He sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, his usually sharp features betraying the first signs of unease. The game was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. Across from him Miss Evelyn Carter, a woman whose keen intellect had already dismantled many a liar, sat poised like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The prosecution had called their star witness, Michael Collins, the train conductor, a man whose guilt clung to him like a shadow. His hands shook as he placed them on the stand. The air in the courtroom grew thick as the first question was fired, direct and merciless. Mr. Collins, on the night of Henry Ashford's murder you altered the train's timetable. Tell us why. A pause, a deep breath. Collins' eyes flickered toward Eastwood, then to the expectant faces of the jury. I was told to, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Told by whom? Mr. Eastwood, Collins confessed, and just like that the first crack in Eastwood's alibi splintered open. The murmur in the courtroom was instant, hushed voices colliding in a wave of realization. Eastwood's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Carter leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze never leaving the defendant. And what were you paid, Mr. Collins? The room stilled. Collins hesitated. It wasn't just money, he stammered. It was a promise. A favor in return. Carter's lips curled ever so slightly. A favor, her voice was as sharp as a scalpel. A favor for silence. The moment stretched thin. The weight of Collins' guilt became unbearable, pressing against the very walls of the courtroom. The defense attorney shifted, ready to object, but Carter wasn't finished. She turned to the jury, her voice lowering to a dangerous calm. This isn't just about a bribe or a falsified timetable. This is about a calculated, premeditated deception. A deception that ensured Lionel Eastwood had an airtight alibi while another man lay dead. She let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. And yet Eastwood was not the mastermind. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Even Eastwood, for the first time that day, looked confused. Carter's gaze slowly drifted toward the back of the room. The real architect of the crime had been hiding in plain sight. The moment was electric, the kind that would be remembered long after the case had ended. The pieces had fallen into place. The truth was no longer waiting to be uncovered. It was standing right there, staring back at them all. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, thick like the weight of an unsaid truth that had long struggled to emerge. The gavel had not yet fallen, but the verdict was already written in the faces of those present. Lionel Eastwood sat motionless at the defendant's table, his hands clenched into fists, his breath uneven as if he had been holding it for too long. Across the room, Henry Lancaster was frozen in his seat, the air around him heavy with a sense of impending doom. His once unshakable confidence had cracked, and now, beneath the weight of undeniable evidence, it crumbled. His knuckles were white as his grip on the polished wooden bench tightened, as if anchoring himself to reality would somehow alter the inevitable. Miss Evelyn Carter had seen this moment coming. She had anticipated the precise second when Lancaster's mask would slip, when the man who had manipulated the law, twisted reality, and buried the truth would finally be exposed. Her voice, calm yet relentless, cut through the courtroom's tense air. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, her tone carrying the weight of every lie she had unraveled, "you thought you could control the narrative, that with enough money, enough deceit, you could reshape reality itself. But you made a fatal mistake. You underestimated the truth." Lancaster swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The sweat gathering at his temples betrayed his attempts at composure. Carter stepped forward, her eyes locked onto his, her next words hanging in the air like the blade of a guillotine. "You bribed Mr. Collins to alter the train schedule, ensuring Eastwood's alibi would hold. You tampered with the evidence. You planted false leads, throwing suspicion onto an innocent man." A murmur rippled through the gallery, the weight of the accusation settling over the crowd like a thick fog. Lancaster still said nothing, but Carter wasn't done. She took a step closer, her voice unwavering. "And when Reginald Ashford found out, when he threatened to expose you, you silenced him." The words struck like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the courtroom. Lancaster flinched, his face, which had once held an air of superiority, twisted into something unrecognizable, fear. A silent war waged within his mind as he grasped at straws that no longer existed. The judge, impassive and stern, broke the silence. "Mr. Lancaster, do you have anything to say in your defense?" The room held its breath. Lancaster's lips parted, but no sound emerged. The weight of it all, the lies, the bribes, the betrayal, had rendered him speechless. The judge's gaze didn't waver. "Very well," he said, voice firm. He turned to the bailiff. "Take him into custody." The gavel struck. A sharp, final sound. The courtroom exhaled, the tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. Lancaster's face drained of color as officers approached, steel cuffs clicking shut around his wrists. He did not struggle, did not protest. He simply stared ahead, his eyes blank, hollow. And then, as he was led past Carter, their eyes met just for a fleeting moment. There was no hatred in his gaze, no anger, no plea for mercy. Just the empty look of a man who had run out of moves. A man who had lost. The gallery erupted into murmurs, the air buzzing with energy. Some wore expressions of satisfaction, others of shock, but all had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Justice had prevailed. The truth had won. Lionel Eastwood, still seated, let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. He looked at Carter, his exhaustion evident, but there was something else in his expression, something unspoken, a gratitude so deep it could not be put into words. Carter acknowledged him with the smallest of nods. She had done what she came to do. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now justice had been restored. But for her, this wasn't about triumph. It never was. It was about seeing through the deception, untangling the web of lies, and ensuring the right story was told. As she turned to leave, the echoes of the courtroom fading behind her, a cool wind met her outside. The city stretched before her, its lights flickering like secrets waiting to be uncovered. The puzzle was solved, but somewhere in the shifting shadows another mystery was already waiting. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the last murmurs of conversation fading into the stillness of the late afternoon. Miss Evelyn Graves rose from her seat with practiced grace, her sharp eyes lingering on the polished wood of the defendant's chair, where justice had been decided mere moments ago. The weight of the trial had lifted, yet something deeper, something unspoken, clung to the air, a lingering truth that would not fade with the closing of the case. As she stepped out into the dusky evening, the village beyond the courthouse appeared unchanged, its cobbled streets and flickering gas lamps whispering of a world that moved on, indifferent to the secrets unraveled within those solemn walls. But Miss Graves knew better. The truth never simply disappeared. It settled into the bones of a place, into the hearts of those who had witnessed its unveiling. Back in her sitting room, the fire crackled with a comforting familiarity, its glow casting shifting shadows along the well-worn bookshelves that lined the walls. Outside, the night stretched deep and unbroken, clouds veiling the stars, as if even the heavens wished to hide their secrets. She sank into her favorite armchair, hands instinctively reaching for the small leather-bound journal that had held years of observations, confessions, and the quiet unraveling of countless mysteries. Her teacup sat untouched, steam curling into the dimly lit space as she let her mind drift over the events of the past weeks, the deception, the ambition, the carefully constructed lies that had nearly obscured the truth. Nearly, but not quite. The truth, persistent as the tide, had emerged in the end, forcing its way through the cracks of deception like light seeping through a shuttered window. Greed, fear, jealousy, familiar specters that haunted every crime she had ever investigated, had once again played their part. And yet, there was always something deeper beneath them, something far more human. She ran her fingers over the edge of her journal, then opened it, the scratch of her pen breaking the silence. The guilty believe they can bury the truth, she mused aloud, though no one was there to hear her. But the earth always gives back what it takes. The words settled heavily between the walls of her small yet formidable sanctuary. With a quiet satisfaction, she closed the journal, setting it beside her as the fire continued its rhythmic dance. Outside, the village exhaled, returning to its quiet routine, but Miss Graves knew better than to mistake peace for the absence of mystery. There was always another secret waiting to be uncovered, another thread to unravel. The world had not yet run out of darkness. But for tonight, in the warmth of her home, she allowed herself a moment of rest. The streets of Blackwood Hollow breathed once more, their uneasy silence replaced by the distant laughter of children weaving through the cobbled lanes, their voices light and carefree against the hushed murmurs of the villagers. Tonight the town had gathered in the small clearing by the river, not for a grand affair, not for speeches or revelry, but for something quieter, a collective exhale after the storm. Lanterns flickered in the evening breeze, casting golden halos over faces still marked by the shadows of what had passed. Though the tension had eased, there remained an unspoken weight in the air, a lingering unease nestled between the smiles and cautious glances. The echoes of the past weeks had not yet fully faded. People moved in small clusters, their voices dipping lower whenever certain names were mentioned, as if the walls of Blackwood Hollow still had ears. They would not discuss it openly, not tonight, not when the wounds were still fresh, but everyone knew. The accusations, the lies, the unmasking of one of their own. No one had expected the darkness to fester so close to home, and yet it had, slithering through the very heart of their quiet village. And now, even as peace settled over them like a thin veil, the truth remained, undeniable, unforgettable. Eleanor Dane sat in the corner of the gathering, half hidden in the flickering shadows beyond the firelight. Wrapped in her dark shawl she remained still, her sharp eyes drinking in the scene. Though the people of Blackwood Hollow did not speak of her directly, she could sense the difference in the way they regarded her now. Some stole glances filled with quiet gratitude, while others kept their distance, uneasy in the presence of the one who had stripped away the illusion of their perfect little world. She had not sought attention, nor had she asked for admiration. She had only sought the truth, and in doing so she had forced them all to confront something they wished had remained buried. The air was thick with the scent of mulled cider and fresh bread, yet beneath it was something less tangible, a feeling that the village was not quite the same. Trust had been shattered and pieced back together in fragile fragments. The guilty had been unmasked, their sins laid bare beneath the weight of undeniable evidence, and though justice had been served, the memory of betrayal still clung to the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. The fire crackled softly, casting wavering shadows along the faces of those gathered, their expressions betraying more than their words ever could. Some were relieved, some still haunted, and others carried something far more complex in their eyes. Resentment, fear, a silent recognition that even the most familiar faces could conceal the most dangerous of secrets. Eleanor lifted her cup of tea, letting its warmth seep into her fingers. The steam curled lazily into the cold evening air, dissolving like the whispers that surrounded her. The river murmured softly beside them, its dark surface reflecting the dim glow of the lanterns. It had borne witness to it all, to the deception, the revelation, the confessions spoken in quiet gasps. And though the village had resumed its rhythm, she knew that the undercurrent of unease had not yet faded. It never truly did. The past had a way of clinging to places like this, embedding itself in the cobblestones, the walls, the very air. As the night deepened and the gathering began to thin, Eleanor stood, her movements unhurried, her presence as quiet and unassuming as ever. The world would move forward, the whispers would fade, and the people of Blackwood Hollow would return to their lives, but she knew, in the deepest corners of her mind, that the next mystery was never far. Darkness had a way of creeping back, no matter how many times the truth dragged it into the light. And when it did, she would be waiting.